So let's take a look at Book 1 of the Republic. These talks are, generally speaking, introductory talks. They are meant to hopefully shed some light on the reading to help guide your reading of these texts. A few explanatory things, but generally just a characterization of what's going on, a few ideas, suggestions of mine, and but the burden is really on you to read the text, to do your best to understand it, to work through the study questions, and hopefully in the Limba session, etc., and the feedback you get on your study questions, that you'll have a firm grasp of what's going on. But I would like to say some things about Book 1 of the Republic. It is quite an interesting document. This is, of course, a very long dialogue. It has 10 books. But if you look at Book 1 just in isolation from the rest of the dialogue, it's almost a complete thing in itself. And it's very similar to other dialogues of about the same length that Plato wrote during the same period of his life. And it's kind of a self-contained whole, and it's almost as if it could have stood on its own. Maybe Plato meant it, maybe he didn't stand on its own, but at least at some point he decided that the topic, the issues that were brought up deserved further investigation, and that the questions that he had raised deserved more complete answers than he had given them through Socrates and the discussion in Book 1. So Book 1 is incredibly important. The main issues of the dialogue are raised here. The basic thesis, one might say, that Socrates will be arguing against is raised by a very important character named Thrasymachus. Here, the character who says that justice is merely the advantage or interest of the stronger. So it's very, very key to establishing what's going on in the dialogue, what the basic questions are, etc. It should be clear that the basic subject is justice, and that they're talking about justice in general, and they're talking about associated issues having to do with justice. I would say that the first really interesting philosophical exchange that goes on, or the first time that the question of justice is raised, is by the character Cephalus, the old man who Socrates begins to ask some questions of in the beginning of the dialogue. Now, this whole dialogue takes place at the house of Cephalus, although he only appears in the beginning of the dialogue and then sort of drops out of the conversation. Very, very interesting exchange, and if we look at the exchange between Socrates and Cephalus, which begins around page 2 or 3, around 329a, Cephalus begins to speak. The questions about old age and about what old age is like lead to questions about wealth, and questions about wealth lead to questions about justice. That is, when Cephalus is asked by Socrates, around page 4 or so, what the greatest advantage of being wealthy is, Cephalus more or less says that the greatest advantage of being wealthy is that one then has the opportunity to be just, implying that poverty, lack of money, is a reason, a legitimate reason, or an important reason for being unjust. That is, if one has money, one does not have to steal, one does not have to deceive and lie and cheat, and in general be unjust. That is, money gives you the opportunity, the capacity, if you choose to have it, to avoid injustice. And it's that claim on the part of Cephalus that gets things started in Book 1, and then we have Socrates challenging that, of course, and then we have other characters beginning to suggest definitions of what justice is. And for a long time in Book 1, that looks like that is going to be the subject for the whole dialogue. That is, the question, what is justice? What is the just? Which is no doubt a very important part of this book. And we see that much of Book 1 is taken up with Socrates asking for definitions of justice and then having problems with those definitions. But as it turns out, And in my opinion, I think there's a definite argument for this, is the question, what is justice, is not actually the most important question of the dialogue. The most important question of a dialogue is not what is justice. The most important question of the dialogue is how should I live? And that question, how should I live, which is pretty much a version of the classic Greek question, what is the good life? What is the life worth living? That question is pretty much framed in terms of justice, and pretty much framed in terms of the decision one makes in terms of how just one will be. So as we find out by the end of Book 1, what really I think is the driving, central, prior, most prominent question that emerges from this discussion is, which is the better life? The life of justice or the life of injustice?